In late November of 2024, Rod Ferguson, the senior vice president of the Diablo franchise at Blizzard, posted a tweet that ruffled some feathers. He brought up the suggestion that maybe we should start calling certain action RPGs Diablo-likes, and he may have a point. The tweet reads, "Feels like the genre of ARPG is starting to mean a lot of different things. Much like Souls-like and roguelike, I wonder if we could normalize Diablo-like for ARPGs that follow the Diablo formula." Now I know what you're thinking. Dude, shut up. But hear me out. I want you to think about the terms we use for game genres. Roguelikes are pretty clear. Random dungeons, turn-based combat, and when you die, you're dead. Same for Souls-likes. Tough combat, limited healing, losing XP when you die, the works. They tell you exactly what to expect. But ARPGs? That could mean almost anything. The heck is an action RPG? Technically, it's any RPG where you control the attacks directly in real time. That's Zelda, that's Kingdom Hearts, that's Monster Hunter. Can you see the problem? There's a lack of clarity that muddies the distinction, and Rod might be onto something, and we're gonna clear things up. So grab a snack, your preferred drink, tuck in, and stay a while and listen. Time to get really specific. The kind of ARPG that Rod's talking about is defined by a particular style, and that's an isometric RPG where you relentlessly click on monsters to get loot, usually in different colors and always in an explosion, and possibly carpal tunnel. And if I'm being honest, that style was created by Diablo in 1996. So, if you'll allow me, let's get into it. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps me out a lot. Now, our story begins, as these stories often do, in California in the 1990s. In 1993 specifically, there was the studio named Condor that was founded by three men. Their names were David Brevik, Eric Schaefer, and Max Schaefer. The three met at FM Waves, a clip art production company that had closed down later in '93. They had worked on a few games following Condor's founding, specifically handheld iterations of the NFL Quarterback series. In between NFL Quarterback releases, Condor was commissioned by Sunsoft to develop Justice League Task Force for the Sega Genesis. When showing it off at CES 95, they had noticed that another company had been working on a version for the Super Nintendo. Neither company had met or even spoke to the other or were aware of their work, and their respective ports came out almost identical. Which, in a cosmic sense, is really funny. That other company was Blizzard Entertainment. Afterwards, the two companies got to talking. The Condor guys mentioned that they were in the middle of pitching a game called Diablo, and Blizzard went, "Hey, you guys seem cool. We're making this game called Warcraft Orcs and Humans, and we think that you would be good partners for future projects. Let's link up." Following the release of Warcraft Orcs and Humans, Condor pitched Diablo, and Blizzard Entertainment accepted. And here's where things start to go corporate. Blizzard, while still a small and scrappy company at that point, was owned by Davidson and Associates. They were mainly a software company that focused on education software. Davidson had acquired Condor in March of 1996, and in doing so, were renamed Blizzard North for around $5.5 million, which, adjusted for inflation, is a little over $11 million. According to the SEC filing that I dug up during my research, Davidson Associates referred to it as small potatoes. But as we say in a lot of sectors of life, there's always a bigger fish. That's because Davidson Associates were themselves in the middle of getting acquired by a bigger company called CUC International. And they were right about it being small potatoes because Davidson offered 256,069 shares for Blizzard North and an eye-watering 30 million shares, or nearly $2.2 billion in today's money, for the CUC merger. So for those keeping track at home, it was Condor into Davidson and Davidson into CUC International. That means that Blizzard North was technically acquired twice in the same year. The tech industry in the 90s was wild. Now that we got all of the corporate hoo-ha out of the way, let's continue. After a very busy early 1995, Condor, now complete with their previous contracts, are a part of Blizzard Entertainment as Blizzard North. And it was in the back half of that year when they began the development of the original Diablo. According to the original design document, Diablo was going to be completely different to what it ended up actually being. While the core of it being a randomly generated dungeon crawler was always going to be the case, it was going to be turn-based, with actions taking up sections of a turn. It was going to have Magic the Gathering style expansion packs where you could buy a disc that had 20 to 30 items on it, and they were going to make it stop-motion based for the animation, and look at Primal Rage as a source of inspiration. These were obviously all changed after feedback from Blizzard Irvine, but the ideas are interesting because of the inspirations. David Brevik originally envisioned Diablo as the next generation update to roguelikes. When you hear that word nowadays, you might think Spelunky Classic or The Binding of Isaac, but I'm talking about the old guard of roguelikes. NetHack, Angband, Moria, and of course, Rogue. Punishing, unforgiving, randomized, and focused on split-second decision-making. Brevik and Blizzard North wanted to recreate and update the tension and potential horror that comes from playing these earlier titles. Because death was permanent, you had to start over. No meta progression, no permanent upgrades, nothing. Do not pass go. Go straight to the gulag. While that sounds like a phenomenal idea to a roguelike enthusiast, the team knew it wouldn't fly if the game just deleted the player's characters like they intended to. Because while Diablo was inspired by roguelikes, it's ultimately still an RPG. It was also intended as a potential advancement for Western RPGs in general. Brevik has stated that the main reason for Diablo having it be immediate between picking your class and loading into the game's world is due to character creation in Western RPGs being so in-depth that it would take upwards of tens of minutes to map out a starting character. And this is between stats, armor choices, weapon choices, whether or not your character can cast spells, etc. This is where the decision to have the three classes of Warrior, Rogue, and Sorcerer come from. This led to a playtest with the main Blizzard studio, and they only had two pieces of feedback. Have the game play out in real time, and have it be multiplayer. David was initially apprehensive of this, so he called an all-hands meeting to vote on the direction of Diablo. While he maintained that it should stay turn-based, he was outvoted by the majority of the office. From there, he decided that he'd be the one to implement it, and later that evening, he got it up and running. In Brevik's own words, he clicked over the first skeleton, and when his character swung, it hit the skeleton, caused it to break into pieces immediately, followed by the clouds parting and God rays spilling forth, and he went, "This is fucking awesome." Following this one change, Brevik showed the now real-time Diablo to the rest of the office, and everyone was on board. Then came another playtest and meeting with the Irvine team, and was also met with resounding praise. But this wasn't the only thing working in Diablo's favor. They took advantage of Super VGA in 640 by 480 to create some incredibly atmospheric lighting. Their art pipeline was ingenious because they would essentially use 3D models to create the basis of it, followed by then converting those models to 2D drawings, then converting said drawings into sprites. They then used a program called Debabbilizer to convert the sprites into sprite sheets and into the lighting sources that they had. They even had the beginnings of the BattleNet service to serve as the intermediary for peer-to-peer multiplayer. And these were all huge at the time. But they weren't without issues. When moving about on the floor, the sprites would get cut off because of the walls being attached to the floors. Blizzard North also signed a contract that only allotted them $300,000 to make Diablo. The multiplayer post-release was rife with cheaters and cheat makers. The list goes on. And that's before the 8 months of crunch needed to get Diablo over the finish line. But then, after over a year of development, on January 3rd, 1997, Diablo was released on PC to ring in the new year. The original Diablo was, in essence, the first action RPG, at least as we have come to know the genre today. Set in the town of Tristram, you play as a lone adventurer who must venture into the town's abandoned cathedral after hearing disturbing stories of demons. From there, you fight your way through various hordes of demons and undead, through said cathedral, its catacombs, the underlying cave system, and finally through a section of hell to kill Diablo, the Lord of Terror and the demon behind all of the goings-on. The elaborate backdrop was a boon for the game's presentation, with the dark, gothic horror-infused visuals being mixed with a little Ray Harryhausen for good measure. Matt Ullman's audio work, which has spawned such iconic lines like Deckard Cain's "Come, stay a while and listen," and the threatening growl of, "Ah, fresh meat," from the butcher, the first boss of the game. This also extends to the music. There wasn't a lot of it, but it was all done by Ullman, who was the game's audio director. This led to yet another iconic piece of Diablo, the Tristram theme. You hear this singular piece of music the most, when getting items identified, when getting your gear repaired, when getting healed, when trading in town, etc. It projects a feeling of safety in an otherwise dark and unsafe game. Diablo was also a game of firsts in other ways. Did you know that Diablo was the game that invented the hotbar? You know, that thing that's the main standard in PC-centric game genres today, from ARPGs to CRPGs to MOBAs to MMOs? Because Diablo introduced that. And I didn't know that until my research. It was also the first game to control player movement entirely through the mouse, opening up what could be done on PC. And there was Battle.net, which served as a foundational piece of networking infrastructure in online gaming. So much so that Blizzard still uses it to this day. Fun fact, it originally only ran on one computer, because that's how Mike O'Brien operated. These, along with its nature of being the first action RPG, birthed a genre overnight. It also had the side effect of making Diablo a critical and commercial success. Based on the reviews that I could find, such as the one from GameSpot, cites Diablo's simplicity as the main factor for its success. Also praised were the gothic tone and art, as well as the replayability and flexibility of the classes, which made it one of 1997's standouts. And in a year that also gave us Symphony of the Night, the original Fallout, GoldenEye, and Final Fantasy VII, that is saying something. Following the holiday crunch needed to get Diablo over the finish line, Blizzard North took some time off to get themselves sorted and figure out what their next project was going to be. Originally, they weren't planning on making a Diablo 2, but after several pitches over the course of 3 to 4 months, the studio decided that a Diablo sequel made the most sense. Another reason was due to David Brevik saying that he was not happy with the way the online worked out. As mentioned earlier, Diablo's nature as a peer-to-peer multiplayer game made it a cheatmaker's paradise. And due to Diablo being peer-to-peer, it was very difficult to crack down on those same cheaters and cheat makers. With an expansion of the team from 20 employees to 40 employees, Diablo 2's development was underway. They established a process that focused on the entire team contributing. This was done by focusing on the moment-to-moment gameplay and taking a nothing-is-sacred approach to iterating on the game. The core gameplay in regards to randomly generated levels, monsters, treasures, and replay value was kept more or less the same. And that was achieved by making sure that playable builds were available as soon as possible, and had the staff playing them as often as possible. The main draw of Diablo was those random elements, and this was kept intact and improved upon. One of the main tenets of development Blizzard North wanted was to expand character classes from 3 to 5. As opposed to the more nebulous and free-form character classes of the Warrior, Rogue, and Sorcerer, Diablo 2 went with the classes of the Sorceress, Amazon, Necromancer, Paladin, and Barbarian. These were specifically chosen because the names were incredibly common, easy to understand, and rooted in Dungeons & Dragons. This was part of Blizzard North's approach to Diablo 2, which can be described as more is more. They went with 800 by 600 as opposed to 680 by 480, 16 directions of movement as opposed to 8, and a planned move to 24-bit color instead of 8-bit. Although that didn't work out, so they settled on a mix of 8-bit color with adaptive technology. But it also came around when Blizzard North was debating on how to proceed with graphics. In the years since Diablo's release, EverQuest had come out and the advent of 3D polygonal-based graphics on consoles and PCs had occurred. Ultimately, the team decided to keep Diablo 2 in 2D, because it would make development go more smoothly and not disrupt their art pipeline. These refinements were also included with new technical and system additions. The first of these is the new Perspective mode. Added late into development, Perspective mode utilized a method in which the game's world was drawn and rendered in 2D sprites and then stretched over 3D polygons. This gave the overworld a lot of depth and made the game feel 3D without actually being in 3D. It was considered a revolutionary feature for its time because of the dynamism that it added to the world. Another feature added was dynamic streaming of the game's world. This meant that Diablo 2 would load in chunks at a time instead of all at once, to cut down on loading times, which would go on to serve as a foundation for how World of Warcraft would handle its world streaming. The last major feature was client-server multiplayer. This was added mainly as a means of addressing cheating. Some of these were what Brevik referred to as shower ideas. Things that he could think of while in the shower or out of the office and come in and talk to the crew about. The aforementioned perspective mode was one of these ideas. But perhaps the most important of all of these was the skill tree. Inspired by the technology trees of 4X strategy games like Civilization and Masters of Orion, the skill trees in Diablo 2 were the bedrock upon which character builds were created. With each of the classes getting specific focuses on specific skills and types of gear they could use, it was used mainly to address the bad build traps found in the first game's more open-ended class progression. The skill tree proved to be a rousing success, allowing for a lot of builds to be found in similar systems being used in other games for decades to come. While all of this makes it sound like there was a smooth development process, it was far from that. The first instance was some contentious changes to crafting. Originally, Blizzard North wanted you to pick up animal body parts to use instead of the Herodric Cube, Diablo 2's main crafting mechanic. When the main Blizzard branch in Irvine saw this, they told North that it was too gruesome because they were carrying around a sack full of body parts. After a while, the team decided to remove the body part crafting system because ultimately, it was distracting from the main focus, getting your hands on cool loot. But the vote was contentious, with those wanting to keep it having full-on protests and signs saying "keep the body parts" taped to their office doors and cubicles. All of the features that were added caused the scope to balloon and development time to be added. As a result, they aimed for a Christmas '99 release and went into crunch to make it happen. After missing it, Blizzard Irvine, upon seeing this, told North to take it easy, which they did. Although they did continue to crunch overall for the better part of a year. The main thing it brought about was a reduction in scope. The most prominent things that were cut was one of Diablo 2's acts, shortening the game from 5 acts to 4. The other was the BattleNet Town, a hub area where all players could interact with each other and NPCs before going off into an instance version of the game's world. And the problems kept on rolling. A few days before the game went gold, Blizzard North's source control, a program called Source Safe, got completely corrupted and they couldn't access any of the backups. So they had to stitch Diablo 2 back together through bits and pieces that were on everyone else's computers, which came at the cost of some things being lost forever. They did manage to get Diablo 2 up and running again after a week of doing this. In a less catastrophic but still stressful piece near the end of development, Matt Ullman, the sound designer and composer, had written and composed Diablo 2's music for a live orchestra and wanted to be recorded as such. It was a huge gamble because no one other than Ullman would be able to hear the music, and the rest of the team couldn't give feedback so he could iterate on it. But ultimately, they took the chance and flew Ullman out to link up with the Slovak Radio Symphony Orchestra, and it paid off. The rest of the team loved the music, and Diablo 2's soundtrack is beloved to this day. After that intense roller coaster ride, Blizzard North released Diablo 2 on June 29th, 2000. After taking some time off, the team at Blizzard North got together and decided to begin work on the expansion for Diablo 2, Lord of Destruction. Its key features were the addition of the Assassin and Druid classes, the addition of a new mechanic for giving items to properties called Rune Words, and a new 5th act based on the cut 4th act but rewritten to fit narratively. Lord of Destruction was released almost a year to the day on June 27, 2001. Both Diablo 2 and Lord of Destruction were met with critical and commercial success. The original PC Gamer review cited its refining of a tried and tested formula, embracing the RPG archetype head-on, and the genuine flexibility of its character development, for it being awarded that issue's Game of Distinction award. Eurogamer's archived review cites these as well as it really leaning into the action RPG distinction of its predecessor. But it wasn't without negatives, chief among them being networking issues, duping and cheating at launch that were resolved post-release, and not being as tonally dark as the first game, a consequence of it being set in more outdoor locales. On October 23, 2003, the game's 1.10 patch was released. Considered the final update to the game, it added new rune words, a new endgame activity, the ability to revive mercenaries, purchase mana potions in town, created Uber bosses, specifically Uber Diablo, as a means of solving the Stone of Jordan issue with the economy. Short version, an item called the Stone of Jordan was so plentiful that it was used as trading currency. And this is along with balance changes and the addition of skill synergies, all done by one person, Peter Who. This patch, as well as the general passing of time, led to Diablo 2 being hailed as a modern classic. So many games and so many game developers in this space consider Diablo 2 to be an inspiration to them. Hell, it's still got a bit of a following going today between the modding scene and the speedrunning/challenge running communities that it has on Twitch. These have cemented Diablo 2 in the eyes of many as one of the greatest action RPGs of all time, if not the greatest action RPG of all time. And now for something completely different, because I want to talk about my personal experiences with Diablo and Diablo 2, mainly because I never actually played them when they first released. So this would be something of a different perspective than what you're all used to. They're surprisingly quaint by today's standards. Going from playing Path of Exile 2 over the holidays to playing Diablo and Diablo 2 for this video made me realize that when you strip away a lot of the extra systems, means of engagement, and just general cruft, the basic appeal is still there. I'd even go so far as to say it's at its most undiluted, especially in the case of the original Diablo. All it has going for it is the basic act of clicking on enemies until they die, and collecting what falls out of them. It's most apparent when I fought both the Butcher and the Skeleton King. It's the ARPG equivalent of shooting at a cyber demon until it dies. There were times when I was playing to record footage, and ended up losing track of time. I just ended up going into a flow state of clicking on stuff and seeing it explode and collecting the remnants and going back to town to restock, going back into the dungeon, etc. The loop is so simple, but it's so goddamn satisfying. And there were times in Diablo where I needed to make use of the terrain and kite enemies because there were no dodge rolls or movement skills here. I think it's incredibly impressive that even almost 30 years later, the basic act of clicking on monsters to get loot is still one of the most satisfying gameplay loops ever created. And that quaintness also applies to the presentation. Nowadays, I look at it and go, this is charming and cute in a macabre way. Where in 1996, I'd have been scared shitless by Diablo like a bunch of people who probably played it way too young. Because Diablo is like the original Fallout in that it's basically a horror game. You can see the sprites have a Ray Harryhausen quality to them, which feels like a holdover from the original pitching for Diablo to be stop-motion animated. It's good stuff. And Matt Ullman's music on top of that also sells the basically a horror game vibes. With the exception of the Tristram theme, it's all varying flavors of droning, scraping on walls, the occasional scream of bloody murder. It puts you in the mindset of, this is a dark and scary dungeon. Hope the loot was worth it. And 9 times out of 10, it was. While the game still has aged in some areas, mainly quests with weird triggers, Diablo is still an interesting game that I highly recommend anyone who likes ARPGs today to give at least a try if you somehow haven't. Now for Diablo 2. While you can make the argument that Diablo was the first ARPG, I think it's more apt to say that it was Diablo 2. In terms of being a sequel, Diablo 2 is as big a leap as, to keep it modern-ish, going from the first Assassin's Creed to Assassin's Creed 2. It's just an improvement in every single way. The story is more expansive, going from the basic town on top of a cursed labyrinth setup to a world-spanning adventure that also ends in the realms between heaven and hell. And this is where they follow up on StarCraft's work on the Blizzard cinematic. You know the ones. Those really cool cinematics that were used for marquee moments and still kind of are. Those were, and still are, the fucking best. Matt Ullman's orchestrated music adds a lot of ambiance, and there's a lot of good tracks to kill demons with. I'm playing on the resurrected version, which could be an entire video on its own. But for authenticity's sake, I went with the original graphics, and god damn do they still hold up. I think it might be a good reason for why a strong art direction is so important in a video game. Almost 25 years later, and this shit still looks good. And the world is a series of hub areas that are interconnected with warp points, and that fancy perspective mode really does add a lot of dynamism to the game's world. From a gameplay perspective, it's an incredibly focused and more scaled up version of Diablo. More enemies on screen, more classes to mess around with, more items to loot, more bosses to kill, and this is before the improvements. The skill trees let you make builds for very specific but very powerful playstyles. Barbarians could be weapons experts that shouted war cries. Paladins could support allies with auras and damage enemies with holy magic. Sorceresses could mix and match various fire, ice, and lightning spells, and so on and so forth. It's very simple, but very impressive that Blizzard North actually did skill trees and nailed them on their first try. And on top of the big dungeons for quests, you also get a bunch of smaller random dungeons that can be cleared out. Like Diablo, I found myself loading into Diablo 2 just to play it. I'd record and take notes, sure, but I also just really like how it feels. They somehow managed to make it feel even better, and that's shocking to me. I'm actually thinking about playing it right now. That's how hard it's got its hooks in me at the moment. But that's enough about my takeaways. We still got a major question to answer. Now that I have all the goddamn history and my experiences out of the way, allow me to posit the question from the beginning of this video. Is Diablo-like a viable name for this particular subgenre of video game? Based on the number of games made by Blizzard North alumni, game developers who were inspired by Diablo 2, and my own recent forays, I'd say hell yes. Pun not intended. In the case of the first game, not really. It was the first, a proof of concept, a new animal that had made its way onto the scene. But you could see the seeds. The beginnings of a new genre were there, but it was mainly a solitary weed. Diablo wore its roguelike influences on freshly looted sleeves, with a replayability that made it hard to put down. But it was still a niche title. It wasn't until Diablo 2 and Lord of Destruction that the player base realized that they had something. All you have to do is look at the biggest contemporaries in the genre in the nearly 25 years since the release of Diablo 2 to feel its influence. From the Torchlight series, to Titan Quest, to Grim Dawn, and of course the most obvious of them all, Path of Exile. Itself a game made by a group of Diablo 2 diehards that served as a spiritual successor from its 2013 release and is still going strong to this day. Hell, it's got a sequel in early access right now. It was also partially why I'm making this video, and on the terms of its influence in regards to so many games that have come since then. Yes, the term Diablo-like, as Rod Ferguson coined, is 100% a viable alternative to ARPG, but it doesn't make it a new moniker for that style of RPG. Part of it is because language, while malleable, is glacially slow with its changes for popular terms. One only needs to look at the attempts at replacing Metroidvania with search action to get a good idea, despite that being an infinitely worse name than Metroidvania. The other is because there's more than one style of action RPG. It's a wide net that can't be easily shaken. But for the stripped down, light on stats, big on clicking stuff to get loot, repeat formula, I think Diablo-like works, even if it's less of an eloquent way of summarizing things. But that's more so for the early days of the genre. I want to take a look at the later entries in Diablo to see if the term Diablo-like can still be used. And I think it'll be interesting because I'm more familiar with Diablo 3 as a game than the rest of the series, so I'm eager to see how its development history pans out. Plus there's a lot to talk about with this one and Diablo 4, the latter of which is still being supported. So if you made it this far, thank you for watching. I'm trying something different and wanted to go more in depth with the history aspect of these videos because that seems to be the parts that everyone likes. So I wanted to try that and see where it went, and judging by the fact that this script is more than double the usual video, I'd say that was a success. If you have any feedback, please leave it in the comments. I'll be checking them out and also interacting with you lovely folks. We'll be back in Sanctuary soon, so thanks for staying a while and listening.